The broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Hi, everyone. Thank you all for coming to our webinar, Strategizing for the Effects of COVID-19, Part 2. We truly appreciate you all listening in. I'm the event coordinator for PERMA, Kimberly Freer. Before we get started, I just want to go over some housekeeping items. All of your lines are currently muted, and today's presentation can be found in the handout section to the right of your screen. If you have any questions, you can ask them in the chat feature on the right of your screen, and there's also going to be a Q&A at the end of the presentation. Before we get started, are there any questions? Okay, perfect. And I would like to welcome our speaker, Director of Fiscal Analysis and Senior Economist at the Rockefeller Institute, Laura Schultz. Hi, Laura.
Hi, Kimberly. Thank you so much for having me back. The last time I was here was exactly a month ago, and a lot has changed in that month. So speaking with Kimberly, we thought it might be helpful to do another update to give you a sense of where we are now and share the information that we know now, but still acknowledge that there are a lot of unknowns with this situation. I want to give you a background on the Rockefeller Institute. We are SUNY's public policy think tank. We're located in Albany, New York, and our goal is to provide policymakers and researchers with the information that they need to make informed decisions. So we do a lot of work on data. We focus on economic development. We focus on healthcare. We have a lot of valuable resources on our website, and I recommend that you check it out. So today we're going to talk about what's been happening in New York since the COVID crisis began. The pause order was March 22nd, and the last webinar that we did was on April 7th, so we were only 3 weeks into this. We are now at the point where we're discussing reopening in various regions across New York and in several parts of the national economy, but we still have a great deal of uncertainty ahead of us. We don't know how the public health situation is going to change when these restrictions are lifted and if there will be a second wave. We don't know how consumers are going to return back into the economy, but what I'm sharing here today is what's current as of May 7th. So this morning, the US Department of Labor released that 33 million people, the data related to unemployment insurance claims. And we know that 33 million people have applied for unemployment in the last 7 weeks. And in New York, it has been 1.8 million. So that gives you a sense of the scale and the scope of this challenge. And today I'm going to talk about unemployment. We're going to talk about the economic situation, the forecast for the future, and then we're going to talk about how municipalities are responding to it, and then finally discuss the current state of negotiations with the federal government for the state and local bailout. So the unemployment claims, here are the claims on April 11th. This is the national picture. On the left hand of your screen were the claims as of April 11th in the states, and you can see certain states are very heavily hit. Nevada, which is a hub for hospitality, Las Vegas being shut down, has had very high levels of UI claims, unemployment claims. Pennsylvania has been hit particularly hard, as has Michigan, with manufacturing being shut down. They also took a look at the states with the most vulnerable workforces, and we see that Florida, Louisiana, Montana, Nevada are also likely to be hit hard. And in the most recent unemployment data, Florida has been hit hard. In both cases, New York is really in the middle of the road, but we have some more data that takes a look at officially what's been happening in the employment scenario in New York. the division of the budget worked with Boston Consulting Group to recently put together a forecast for the economic impact of COVID on New York State. Here is the data that they have through April 18th that looks at where unemployment has been happening in New York. The bulk of it has been, the rest of New York has seen a large growth in the number of unemployment claims versus New York City. And we have more information that would allow us to break this down. These are the regional unemployment filings. The most recent data available at this level was April 18th. And this shows you the number of UI, unemployment insurance filings that have occurred in the 10 regional economic development councils. And as a point of comparison, I've included employment levels in 2019 for Q3. So this was the last time we have data on the size of the workforce in these regions. And we can see here the share of unemployment, the share of the workforce that is currently unemployed. We can see that Western New York and Long Island have been hit a bit harder. And then the capital region has been relatively insulated. Capital region is insulated because of its big state workforce. Not many people have been furloughed from that industry yet. This was through April 18th, and as of the data that came out this morning, New York State's unemployment appears to be about 19% of 2019 employment levels. So I would imagine that all of these are a little bit higher, given that there are now 3 more weeks of claims to be had. I think that it can be helpful to look at sectoral breakdown, because in each of your communities, you have a better sense of what sectors play an important role in your regional economies, and looking at these sectors can give you a better sense of the particular hits that you could be facing. The sectors that have been hit by far the hardest are accommodation and food services. They represent almost 20% of all claims made in New York State for unemployment insurance. And as of 2018, over a third of the people who worked in this sector had filed for unemployment. Arts, entertainment, and recreation also has a high unemployment rate with over a third. Other services, the barbers, the hairdressers, the daycares, the repair shops, they all had to close as a result of New York on pause, and we see a relatively large share of unemployment there. The mining sector has had a relatively high level of unemployment, which may be impacted more from, this is the data in the graph over here to the left is national, and this one here on the right is New York. Retail trade, also not a big surprise. These are the industries that were forced to shutter as a result of New York on pause. The second tranche of industries that were impacted were janitorial, landscapers, laborers, security guards. These are people who were furloughed, again, when things were closed. Manufacturing was facing about a 17.7% unemployment. Construction has been heavily hit. Real estate, transportation, and warehousing have all been facing transportation and warehousing has been facing about a quarter of its workforce. The impacts have been less severe in wholesale trade. Healthcare and social assistance, about a tenth of the workforce is filed for unemployment. Those are from the dental offices, the ambulatory services, all of the people who work in non-essential healthcare. Information has been newspapers, and then you're looking at professional services and management, which to date have seen an increase in unemployment filings, but relatively small compared to other industries. And agriculture, fishing, education, finance, insurance, and public administration have been relatively unimpacted to date. So we can take a look at this and look at the waves of layoffs. The first set of layoffs have been in the full contact industries, the These were the businesses that had to shut down as a result of New York on pause and other social distancing restrictions across the United States. So your accommodation and food services, arts, entertainment, and recreation, and your personal services have all been forced to either close or dramatically change their business operations and can support fewer workers. Wave 2 has been in production and the supply chain, so manufacturing, construction, wholesale trade. When those sales disappeared, the supply chain didn't have anywhere to put its work and had to scale back. And then wave 3, which we're beginning to see now in the initial numbers, are the white collar workers. These are the furloughs for management, finance, insurance, and public administration and government. These are where the colleges have started to furlough people. School districts are looking at job cuts, and we've seen job cuts also in local and state governments. Employment's one part of the picture. The other part is GDP growth, and this is the measure of output in the national economy. And these numbers came out last week, and in Q1 of 2020, the US output fell by almost 5%. And in reality, COVID didn't really start until the end of March, mid to the end of March. So we're looking at 2 to 4 weeks of COVID-19 policies and social distancing, and that resulted in a 4.8% drop. We are likely going to see one of the worst quarters in economic history in Q2, because essentially a lot of economic activity in Q2 has been forced to stop, and we will likely get worse than even 1958, with some economists predicting as low as a negative 25% fall in economic activity. I think it can be helpful to take a look at how consumer activity has been changing, because this is going to affect the sales in your sales tax in your jurisdictions. This is from the Division of Budget report, and they took a look at credit card sales at the end of March. Green represents the rest of the state, and gray is just New York City. What we see is that week in mid-March, where we knew that a shutdown was likely to come, a lot of people hit grocery stores, wholesale clubs, they hit the big box stores and started to purchase heavily for a potential restricted activity. So we see a big jump in credit card activity in mid-March at 21%, but it has fallen dramatically since then. In New York City, credit card activity sales has fallen by 23%, and in upstate it's been 14%. These are a little more severe. Census Bureau has found a 8.7% decline in retail sales since 2020. And the Bureau of Economic Analysis, the GDP, personal consumption can give us a hint as to where this is happening. The biggest increases, so we've seen in general a decline in purchases and economic activity, but some areas are doing relatively well. Food and beverage for off-premises consumption has gone up almost 10%. So this is spending at grocery stores. Other non-durable goods, this would again be your big box stores purchases. This is where the toilet paper is and all of the other things required for household. The household would be in other durable goods. Financial services have gone up. Recreational goods and vehicles has gone up a little bit, but we've seen really big declines in sales of clothing and footwear, motor vehicles and parts, transportation services, recreation, and then restaurants, food services and accommodation. So this can give you a sense, and this was really just March, of how consumers' behavior has changed as a result of the stay-in-place orders across the U.S. I have here, this is part of the Division of Budgets estimates of what this economic impact is going to be. They are attempting to forecast how long this is going to last, and how big an impact it's going to have. What we see here is a trough. This is going to be the low. The Division of Budget and the economists that they've been working with predict a 12% decline in economic activity in Q2 of next year, of this year. And then they're assuming that in Q3, on July 1st, the New York State economy is going to start to reopen, and we're going to see a pretty quick recovery. The model that they used is acknowledging that there is going to be a partial restart with construction and manufacturing happening first, and then phasing in industries over the remainder of Q3 and possibly Q2. But they are not anticipating that New York State will get back to the same level of output that it had prior to COVID until 2023. That's going to happen in the Q1 of 2023. So they're anticipating here directly the loss of economic activity as a result of COVID is $243 billion. And then an additional $202 billion were lost because New York was knocked off of its GDP growth trajectory. It was anticipating 2% growth. What's really important to remember when you're looking at these is that it's assuming no additional shutdowns. They make that clear that this is assuming that when New York reopens, and it reopens slowly, that it's going to be able to manage COVID outbreaks, that people are going to be tested and it will be controlled, and that there won't be any additional shutdowns required within the state. They took a look at this. They estimated the impacts across 3 parts of the state. The biggest impact is going to be felt in New York City, where it's going to be a 12% decline as a result of the recession, the COVID recession. Greater New York metro area won't be hit as badly, and it looks like upstate New York will have a less serious impact. The sectoral GDP forecasts can be very helpful if you're thinking about your local economies. Accommodation and food services, they are not expecting that sector to get back to pre-COVID level of economic activity until the second half of 2024. It is the sector that is going to have the longest crawl back as a result of the crisis. The largest single impact was in 2020, but in 2021, they acknowledged that a lot of people may not be willing to travel or go out to eat until there has been a vaccine, so that the industry won't really be able to recover until a vaccine is in place. The construction sector will have a large immediate impact, and again, a continued impact as a result. Construction generally falls when there's been a downturn, economic downturn. Businesses and consumers aren't willing to make investments in construction. Finance and insurance is going to be relatively unimpacted by this sector, which is important for New York because so much of the state's revenue comes from the finance and insurance industry and the incomes earned by its workers. So that sector should be recovering within the next year. Healthcare and ambulatory services is having its biggest impact having an impact now, but they anticipate that pent-up demand for dental care, eye checks will have these businesses back up and running pretty shortly. Retail, an immediate hit, but again, we're seeing a lot of retail businesses closed. J.Crew filed for bankruptcy yesterday, and we're wondering whether or not these businesses are still going to be in operation, and if the sector will return to full speed, and the forecast is not until 2024. Finally, the transportation industry is also going to have a long slog to return. So the division of the budget has estimated these impacts, the budget gaps that are going to result as a result of COVID. They are looking at a $13.3 billion budget shortfall this year and closer to $16 billion over the next 3 years. I thought it would also be useful to look at some other sorts of tax projections. The New York State Association of Counties did an analysis in mid-March where they were anticipating a 4 to 12% loss in sales tax revenue for counties. Moody's did an analysis a little bit later, a couple of weeks later, where they looked at a decline in sales in the food and beverage industry and the hotel occupancy and car rental taxes, and they're seeing some very serious declines in sales and the sales tax being generated in these industries. The New York State Association of Counties issued a report yesterday where they did a more detailed analysis. They anticipate if there is a mild recession, counties will lose a total of $780 million in sales tax revenue. In a more severe recession, it's almost a $2 billion hit. So that's almost a 9 to 22% range of potential losses. So I presented this last time, and this looks at where the New York State government and where New York local governments raise their revenue on average. So the biggest support for the New York State government is the federal government, and at this point, we don't know what federal support is going to be as a result of this crisis. New York's local governments rely heavily on state government funding and have been told to anticipate as much as a 20% decline in state support to school districts and local governments. Property taxes are not going to immediately be impacted by this. Forecasters aren't seeing necessarily property values changing. There may be some more defaults on property taxes than before, but they are not anticipating the immediate impact being felt now. Future years may have more of an impact. Sales taxes, the forecasts range from 10 to 25% declines. Individual impact income taxes, we're looking at a 10 to 20% decline. New York State is playing with that range. Corporate income taxes, they're looking at about 10%. And based on what I've read about various local governments, they're seeing a 15 to 40% decline on their miscellaneous revenue charges. So that's the fact that the parking lots aren't operational. Parking violations aren't being paid. Other revenue generation that the cities and local communities earn are going to have a decline as people stay inside. So based on this, with no federal funding, a mild case would be a 10% loss in local government revenues. The worst case, based on these ranges, would be a 17% loss in local government revenues. But a lot of this depends on the revenue sources for your individual municipalities. Regions that rely heavily on tourism will likely have a bigger hit, and it could get worse. In addition, that's only one part of the local budget scenario. We also have to look at the additional expenditures. So there's healthcare responses, overtime that has to be paid, additional medical care expenses, equipment investments, and the longer term costs are still relatively unknown because we don't know come fall what kind of services are going to need to be offered. And we have seen this impact in headlines in the last week about all sorts of regions across the state letting their COVID budget impacts be known. Albany is looking at a shortfall of 20 million, Buffalo, Syracuse, Schenectady is looking at cutting its police force. The Erie County Comptroller declared a budget deficit for the county because they don't think they see a decline in revenues, and they won't meet revenue projections for this year. All of these articles are talking about furloughs and layoffs and the loss in services that are likely going to have to they'll have to implement unless there's then federal support. Nationwide, the National League of Cities has estimated a 300,000 to 1 million public sector furloughs nationwide if there's no federal assistance. And almost all municipalities and school districts are discussing reducing their workforce to close budget gaps. There's discussion of not filling open positions, offering retirement incentives, temporary furloughs, and permanent layoffs are likely. And it's important to know that as New York State is projecting, this impact on budgets will likely last years. New York State's prediction is that analysis is for the next year, 4 years out. When economists are talking about support for state and local governments, it is universally acknowledged that they play an important role in the national economy. State and local governments are often one of the largest employers in their local economies. In the Great Recession, state and local governments cut spending, cut their workforce, and lengthened the recovery from the Great Recession. Economists, policymakers are strongly recommending that we not repeat that mistake because we need federal support to allow these essential services to continue to operate and support their local economies. So what kind of support for state and local governments have been delivered to date? The first tranche of the CARES Act delivered $150 billion in funding for states and larger cities. So it was every state got funding and every city or county over 500,000 people got funding. It was distributed on a per capita basis rather than on a need basis, and I can show you in the next slide what that means. It was criticized for being too restrictive because it was limited to coronavirus-related expenses. So it could be used to fund testing centers, it could be used to fund additional services in local retirement homes, but it couldn't be used to cover the shortfalls that are resulting from the crisis. So while it helped offset the expenditure side, it wasn't doing anything on the revenue side. And it's looking like a lot of these municipalities are going to have to return their funds that they've received. In addition, the CARES Act and the Fed put together a $500 billion emergency lending program that would allow cities to have access to short-term debt and offer borrowing at low interest rates to address the liquidity crunches that a lot of communities are facing as a result of revenue delays, but only 10 cities and 15 counties were large enough to qualify. Any smaller jurisdictions had to work with their states, and it was considered too onerous to be able to take advantage of this. So this is some preliminary analysis that we have coming out of the Rockefeller Institute, where we look at where the state and local governments got funding. And all of the small states were guaranteed $1.25 billion in funding. And as a result, the bulk of aid really went to these smaller states. They got a much larger allocation per capita. And then also allocation per COVID case. So for instance, South Dakota got $21.5 million in funding for each person diagnosed with COVID. So this really hasn't been to date allocated based on the need. So now we're talking about the next round of support for state and local governments, and it's currently a very active debate going on in Congress. Overall, the number that keeps getting floated by the think tanks is $500 billion. That's what the Economic Policy Institute wants. That's what the National Governors Association is requesting. National League of Cities is asking for $500 billion for just the local governments for the next 2 years. Democratic proposals have ranged from $700 billion to $1 trillion over the next 18 months. It is certainly, I read a report that said that the COVID crisis really happened at the worst time of year for local governments and for school districts as they are all looking to the July 1st budget. There's just a lot of uncertainty and a lot of uncertainty for the next year. So these communities need to have a better sense of how much money is going to come in so that they can get their budgets adopted for the coming year. And I would imagine that we'll have a much better sense of what that state and local government support from the federal government will be in the next, probably sometime next week. But there are a lot of policy considerations that are a part of this discussion. It is acknowledged that there is a very significant variation in how communities are being impacted, and they want to avoid the mistakes of the last allocation and make sure that's being impacted, it's being distributed according to need, not by population. Population is a quick calculation that can distribute the funds quickly, but there are other ways that you can take a look at it. One proposal that I saw said, consider sizing the funding monthly based on the region's unemployment rate. That's a good measure of how economically, how badly a region is hurting economically. But if you make those calculations known up front, regions can then plan. And most importantly, it needs to be unrestricted and easily administered. The problem with the last support was that it was restricted to only COVID-related expenses. The real crunch right now is that state and local governments are facing major revenue shortfalls and need to be able to offset those with the funding. One popular proposal is that the federal government should just fund the state share of Medicaid. That would mean that everything a state has budgeted to support the Medicaid program could then be freed up to offset revenue losses. Another one was federally sponsored sales tax holidays, where the federal government could just pay the state and local governments the sales tax, and that would offset those revenue losses. That probably seems one of the less likely. So at this point, now being a couple of more time into this, an additional 4 weeks in, we now see that recovery is going to start soon. Depending on what region in New York you are in, we are probably going to see businesses opening in the next week or 2 weeks. But the recovery is not likely going to be the V shape that we had all hoped for only a couple of weeks into this. While a lot of employees, there was a survey out today that of all the people unemployed, 70% expect to be able to return to the same job. There is some optimism there, but it is going to be a slower recovery for some industries than for others as a result of continued social distancing. New York State is projecting revenue challenges for the next 4 years out, and municipalities should be considering that too. And without aid, municipalities could be seeing revenue shortfalls of up to 20%. The assistance needs to happen, the federal assistance needs to happen sooner rather than later. And certainly there have been a great deal of lobbying efforts, and a lot of the news articles about municipal budget shortfalls in the past week have been in an attempt to ratchet up pressure onto the federal government. And support for federal assistance to state and local governments has been a nonpartisan issue among governors and mayors of both Republican and Democrats have admitted that there needs to be more assistance from the federal government to help local governments offset this. So happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much, Laura. That was great. If you do have any questions, you could put them in the chat feature. I can read them off, or you can always email questions if you think of one later on to our member services account. That's memberservices@perma.org. Also, I've been receiving a lot of emails after the webinars where to access the recording ones, because we are recording every one. They're on our YouTube channel. So you search PERMA NY, and then you'll see all of our webinars as well. I'll just wait a few more minutes for questions if we do get any. I think we do have one. Many New York municipalities are relying on AIM and CHIP fundings for villages, towns, and city work. Since locals represent 8.5% of GDP, who is lobbying for them so they might get some funding to better support them? Some counties have already received large chunks of funding. Do these counties share to the local village level? Any thoughts on New York schools? Governor suggested cuts over 20% initially.
So what the government, what New York State has been doing, so just a handful of cities and counties in New York State had access to funding. And what New York State has been doing is, as they figure out their allocation to to school districts and to local governments, they're taking into consideration how much they have received in federal funding. So if a school district received $10 million in local funding, it looks like New York State's going to reduce their allocation to that school district by a chunk of that. And I think that's probably going to happen to the local governments too. That was passed as part of the budget in April.
And then one we know you may not have an answer for this, but any thoughts that we may not begin the reopening until much later than May 18th?
I think that really depends on the region and the regional leadership. I think there may be parts of New York that won't open by May 18th. I think the governor did his briefing earlier this week where he talked about the 7 metrics that they're watching. And at the time, none of the 10 REDCs met those requirements. But I think it's going to be a slower rollout for New York than we've seen in other states, and it could take a while. It seems like a wait and see approach is definitely what's being adopted.
Any other questions out there? What guidance can local governments provide for businesses as they begin to reopen?
I would highly recommend local governments partner with their local IDAs and economic development organizations to provide guidance on how to meet social distancing requirements within the workforce, to think about how you could possibly change local zoning laws to help those businesses reopen. One thing being discussed in Albany by city planners is you could close off streets and sidewalks and allow restaurants to set up seating outside that would allow them to expand their business and enable more social distancing. So I think EDOs and IDAs have a good connection with Empire State Development and have a good sense of what those programs are, and local government should absolutely partner with them and connect their local businesses with them and work together to make sure that they can open up safely and as quickly as possible.
Great. I think that was the last question. If you do have any more questions, you can definitely send them in. We'll still get them answered for you. But thank you so much, Laura. This was wonderful. And thank you all for listening. We had a great turnout.
Great. Thank you.
Have a great day, guys.